about midway.
We're about
midway
to
through our. We're about midway through our shtick here, and we have some music listening to do. And I think it might be a nice time for everybody to kind of re-up and start talking back a little bit about how we listen. And the panelists have provided us with some recordings to be able to listen and talk about. And we have the ability on some of them to be able to listen to vinyl and to CD. And just a word about this. This room is actually very well designed for sound. It may not be perfect sonically, but for means of this particular demonstration, it's going to really be excellent. So I think we're kind of in for a treat. And I wanted to start off, Craig, if you don't mind, because we're talking about the beginning stages, record production, the classic record that you did with Chris Whitley, who has passed away, 2 years ago now, whatever?
Yeah, something like that.
The first track in this called Scrapyard Lullaby was the one that I recorded out, and maybe you could just talk a little bit about how you approached Chris when he was. It's a very interesting. Sonically, this is considered an audiophile masterpiece, and it really is. I mean, it really is, and it's been.
Well, it's funny. It wasn't set out to be that at all.
Well, this is what I'd love to hear about it.
Chris, basically, for those that don't know him, was a fantastic singer-songwriter. Really beautiful, kind of folky, blues-based, rock and roll kind of character. A very tortured soul as well, but a beautiful, beautiful songwriter. We became friends a long time ago. I used him as a musician on a number of records I'd worked on. He was signed to Sony for a long time and was dropped. At the point he was dropped, Chris had just finished writing a new body of work, essentially what he was really looking at as like his next record, which is probably yeah, it's probably most of the stuff. There's very few things that were actually left off of that, so that was going to be his next Sony record, essentially. So he was kind of frustrated that he couldn't put it out. And Chris is one of these people that I think is one of the things that's beautiful about music is when somebody actually they can just sit down at a piano or on a guitar or whatever, to sit down with their voice and sing a song, and you're just moved. It's like, the great people that you see in the subway sometimes. You're just stopped in your tracks, and that's what music is. It's all emotion. You just feel it, and nothing else matters. And Chris, it took a little bit to convince him that actually he could do well by just doing it on his own. So originally we had talked about he didn't have a label, so we were just thinking that we would do it ourselves. So we talked about actually doing it in Chris's apartment in the West Village. So we spent a few months just going back and forth through material. We knew we were going to do something really simple, and just as we got ready to record, Chris said that his father had kind of gone away, and his dad had a cabin in Vermont that was empty. So we decided to go to the cabin in Vermont. So we really didn't have any budget to make a record. We didn't have the money to go into a studio. We didn't really have the inclination to go into a studio. Chris and I both shared the idea that music can be recorded anywhere, that it's the song. And as a producer or the engineers that do stuff, you deal with the issues of a room. But if it's a room that feels comfortable to the artist, you're going to get great performances. And Chris loved that cabin. And so we decided to go up there. So me, Chris, and an engineer loaded up a van. We took an old tape recorder, because it was the only thing we could find, a quarter-inch tape recorder. We took a stereo ribbon microphone. And for those of you that don't know about microphones, just briefly, ribbon technology is sort of one of the oldest technologies for microphones. It's very simple. It's literally just a super thin ribbon of metal that vibrates. And the vibrations are changed into an electrical signal, which is then boosted by an amplifier, or a pair of amplifiers in this case, to go to wherever you're going. So in this case, we took two very simple tube amplifiers, which were made by an audiophile. But
Tim?
they were made by Tim DePeravicini.
Crazy audiophile.
Yeah, but I found them at an auction. They were cheap. Nobody knew what they were, and they sound great. They work with ribbon mics. And so we went up to the cabin, and Chris and I both really loved the classic Robert Johnson recordings, where they were all done in a hotel, we really liked that. We liked that as a starting point. So we went up, and there was a kind of a woodshed motorcycle shop that was connected to the house, to the shack, basically. We set Chris up back there, and we led cables down from the microphone through a hallway into the kitchen. The engineer and I set up some monitors and the tape recorder in the kitchen, and that's how we did it. I mean, you know, Chris usually stomped his foot when he played, so to deal with the vibrations from that, we took baling wire and hung the microphone from the ceiling so that we wouldn't get anything from a mic stand vibrating. And the main part of that recording was really about making Chris feel comfortable. And Chris could be incredibly unsure of himself. This is somebody who I think is as good as anybody ever has been, who could do something spectacular and you're just sitting there weeping and he's like, oh man, that's terrible, I sucked, I got to do that again. And in this case, what me and the engineer did was continually through the course of a day just say, maybe it did, but you know, we got to go. Can't stay at the next song, you know. And we just plowed through the material, and Chris was spectacular. So we did the entire record in a day, ordered pizza, had pizza, loaded up everything, and you know, like drove back to the city. So we did the whole thing like that. We just knocked it out. The beautiful thing about a ribbon mic is that if you want to use it to simply capture what's there, it's spectacular at doing that. So what we got on tape was exactly what was happening in the room. You could walk into the room and it sounded like what got there. And it was interesting because I actually had the opportunity with this to go to an SACD as well as to go to vinyl. We just licensed it to a small record company. And then eventually Sony approached us actually about doing an experiment with SACD and came to you, Greg, and we did an SACD. And I have to agree, I think that SACD was it's as close as sitting down and listening to the master. Right.
So I want to jump in just so this is a very direct process. You heard Craig. So you have a microphone.
Yeah, it's as simple as you get. You can't
mic pre's.
Mic pre's. That's it.
Out of the mic pre's into a small mixer, or no?
Nope.
No.
Straight into a tape recorder.
Straight into a tape recorder.
Yeah.
So, and we'll talk a little bit. Hopefully,
and then we just
process.
And then we just monitored back.
Now you have a tape which comes into a mastering studio, and when it comes to cutting of vinyl, you're just going through an amplifier to get into the cutter head. So there's really
nothing's touched it. There's
very few things in between. Yeah. And if we were to ever have the time to describe to you what goes into making, Kevin would be able to detail what goes into making the average album now, and how many stages, how many digital conversions there are, and how many stages, and how many mults, and how many combinations of things. All by the time you actually get it at the end, you wouldn't believe it. We wouldn't have time to even talk about it. We'd have to have a weekend. So what I'd like to do now, if we can cue up number 9, I'd like to listen to a little bit of this song. Okay. And Chris, when did Chris pass away?
About 3 years ago.
2-3 years ago. Yeah. He was in his 40s. Yeah. So we're going to listen to the CD first, and then right after that, we're going to cue up the vinyl, listen to the vinyl, and everybody just kind of relax, give a listen. I don't want to sit and debate, which is the better format, but just to throw a couple of little technical things. And first of all, this is an LP, which a 33 1/3, but this is a 45. So a 12-inch 45 is kind of like the ultimate form. Well, 78 is pretty good too. I mean, the faster the table spins, the more room there is for the grooves to kind of do all the cutting that you need to get all the nuances. So this is really the 12-inch 45 is a really great format. Now, again, the signal went from the tape through a volume amplifier into a cutter head. With the compact disc, it went to an A to D converter, analog to digital. It took it and made a 44.1. Which is a Red Book, consumer Red Book standard CD. I don't want to say who heard the difference or who didn't hear the difference. Craig would like to make a point about the difference between listening to analog and digital.
One of the things that happens that's really interesting with it, and I was thinking about what you were talking about in terms of SACD and that being sort of the ultimate. It doesn't get better beyond that. A lot of people have done research into, and I'm sure you're aware of this, of looking at just what happens with different sampling rates in digital audio. One of the people who I use a lot of equipment by, in particular mic pre's, Tim DeParavicini, who's an audio designer, really is one of the people that kind of believes in incredibly high sampling rates as a way of dealing with it. But what happens essentially is that as human beings, we do have limited hearing to a point, especially as people get older, your hearing drops off. But the thing that's odd about that is that it's been shown over time through different forms of research and experiments that we take sound in through our bodies. We get high frequencies in through our skin. Our body cavities take in lower frequencies. So one of the things that happens with vinyl or with analog tape, which I'd agree with you, Kevin, is the best way to hear something is listening to it off the tape. It's like it doesn't get any better than that, but nobody can hear that. It allows our body to, it allows frequencies through that our body can get, that get brick-walled. That is, they get shut off by Red Book CDs. Red Book CD simply slams shut. So any of the harmonic information that's above, a certain frequency is gone or really distorted. When you start to get into beyond just the sine waves, but the square waves, the sawtooths, they're incredibly distorted. So you're really hearing it's incredibly cut off. There's an interesting experiment that happened. Not an experiment. It was an accident that occurred with a very famous recording engineer who you know, named Jeff Emmerich, who is the engineer that recorded a lot of Beatles material. And he was working in a studio of his that he had, and there was a desk there that was a Neve desk, which is a guy named Rupert Neve, for those of you that don't know about recording equipment, who designed a mixing desk, a recording desk for people. A very, very famous guy. The desks are very famous. And Emmerich had an issue with one of the channels in his desk. And he kept calling technicians in, and people kept coming in. They said, there's nothing there. And Emmerich kept saying that he was hearing something. And everybody said, no, it's impossible. We've looked at it. We don't hear anything. Neve came in and looked at it. And they analyzed it with some other piece of equipment that hadn't been brought in. And what Emmerich was sensing, he wasn't hearing it. He was sensing something in one channel that was up around 58,000 cycles. And he didn't hear it, but he felt it. His body felt it. And it's a perfect example of how, as human beings, we perceive sound. We don't always hear it, but we feel it. CDs stop us from feeling it. So the irritation that people feel, the lack of the ability to sit down and really focus in on something or listen, has a lot to do with that. If we have a delivery method that is, whether it's like SACD or anything else, if we have that where it's a much higher sampling rate, it's completely different. We can feel things because our bodies aren't fighting the sensation that they're being deprived of something. And it's the same thing of, what's his name? The guy that started the slow food movement in Italy, of his whole thing of like, look, like we can sit down at a table and we can eat and we can have quality ingredients. Like we don't have to eat this, It's the same thing. It's like slow food. It's like, how can you enjoy it? You can enjoy it with great ingredients, great music, great performances, and a great delivery system. And that allows you to sit down and really enjoy it. You bring your friends into the room, you bring your kids into the room, like, you sit down or you dance or, you're cooking your meals while you're doing it, but it's a part of your life. It's what, it becomes something palpable in that way.
It's the immediacy of that recording, I think, was really great. And I mean, I don't want to do like a show of hands, but I wouldn't mind a secret ballot to see who heard the difference between those two. I would just really be curious. So
wasn't close.
Whatever. But I'd like to move on because we're talking about this very direct approach. Steve Berkowitz provided a really